There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday evening that feels like any other. A conversation that begins with the usual pleasantries. They wear the camouflage of the mundane, and only later, when you trace the map of your own heart back to its turning points, do you realize you were standing on hallowed ground. For me, that moment was the quiet sound of a lock clicking shut. It was the soft weight of another person's head on the pillow next to mine, a presence that was both a profound comfort and a source of the most exquisite, terrifying anxiety I had ever known. He was asleep, his breathing is slow, even tied against the shore of the silent room, but I was awake. I had been awake for hours, cataloging the geography of the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the city exhale outside my window, and trying, desperately, not to move. I was a cartographer of stillness, charting the infinitesimal space between his shoulder and mine, a gulf that felt as vast as an ocean and as thin as a prayer. This, I knew, was the precipice. Everything that came before had been a slow, unknowing climb to this exact point, and everything that would come after would be defined by whether we fell or learned, somehow, to fly. We met at my sister's engagement party, an event that felt, to me, like a symphony of clinking glasses and conversations I did not know how to join. I've always been more of an observer, a photographer by trade and by nature, more comfortable behind a lens than in the center of the frame. I find solace in the quiet act of watching, of capturing the fleeting architectures of emotion on people's faces, a flicker of joy, a shadow of nostalgia, the unguarded truth of a laugh. That night, I was a ghost in a well-tailored suit, orbiting the periphery of the cheerful chaos my sister, Clara, had so effortlessly orchestrated. She was a supernova, drawing everyone into her gravitational pull, and I was a distant moon, content to reflect a little of her light. I was leaning against a brick column on the patio, nursing a glass of champagne that had long since gone flat, when he first appeared in my field of vision. He was not just in the room. He was the room's center of gravity, a point around which laughter and conversation seemed to naturally pivot. This was Leo. He was talking to Clara's fiancé, Mark, a man whose personality was as robust and straightforward as his build. But where Mark was a sturdy oak, Leo was something more fluid, like a river. He moved with an athlete's unconscious grace, a remnant of the years he'd spent as a collegiate swimmer, and his smile was a slow, easy tide that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone it touched. He was a consultant, a job that required him to be charming and articulate, to build bridges of logic and persuasion, and he wore that professional charisma like a second skin. Yet, as I watched him through the comfortable distance of my social anxiety, I saw something else. I saw the way his eyes, a warm and thoughtful brown, would occasionally drift from the conversation, scanning the crowd not with the predatory energy of a socialite, but with a kind of quiet, searching quality, as if he were looking for something he hadn't yet been able to name. I lowered my camera, feeling for a moment like an intruder, and our eyes met across the crowded space. It was a brief, insignificant collision, the kind that happens a dozen times at any party. But he didn't look away immediately. He held my gaze for a beat longer than was customary, a faint, curious furrow appearing between his brows, before his attention was pulled back into the orbit of his conversation. Later, when the party had begun to thin and the energy had softened from a roar to a hum, I found myself cornered by a well-meaning aunt who wanted to know why a handsome young man like me wasn't out there. I was fumbling for a polite, evasive answer when a voice cut in, smooth and warm. Because he's been busy documenting the whole night. Someone has to be the historian. It was Leo. He'd materialized beside me, holding 2 fresh glasses of champagne, and he offered one to me with that easy smile. My aunt, momentarily dazzled, accepted this explanation and drifted away to find easier prey. I was left standing with him in a pocket of relative silence. An awkwardness, thick and immediate, settled over me. I was a master of the unspoken language of images, but the grammar of small talk always eluded me. I thanked him, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. He leaned against the column beside me, mirroring my earlier posture, and for a moment, we just watched the dwindling party. "You're Clara's brother, right?" "Julian," he asked, his tone gentle, as if he were approaching a shy animal. I nodded, surprised he knew my name. "I'm Leo. I work with Mark." We fell into another silence, but this one felt different. It wasn't empty or strained. It was comfortable, companionable. He didn't seem to need me to fill it with noise. He seemed content to just exist in the space with me. "Your sister adores you," he said finally, his gaze fixed on Clara, who was now laughing, her head thrown back, in the center of the patio. "She told me you have the kindest eyes of anyone she's ever known." The compliment was so unexpected, so direct, that it felt like a physical touch. I felt a flush creep up my neck. I mumbled something about sisters being biased, but he just shook his head slightly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe," he said, turning to look at me properly, his eyes searching my face with that same quiet intensity I'd noticed earlier. "Or maybe she just knows how to look." That was the beginning. It was a beginning as unassuming as any other, a conversation that could have easily faded into the background noise of a single evening. But it didn't. We talked for another hour, about his work, which he described with a self-deprecating humor that belied its complexity, and about my photography, a subject I usually avoided because it felt too much like baring my soul. With him, though, it felt easy. He asked questions that were insightful and genuinely curious. He didn't just ask what I photographed, he asked why. He wanted to know what I was trying to find in the light and shadows, what stories I was hoping to tell without words. He listened, truly listened, with an attentiveness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I was craving. By the end of the night, we had exchanged numbers, a gesture that felt both monumental and perfectly natural. As I drove home, the city lights blurring into abstract streaks of color, I felt a strange, unfamiliar buoyancy in my chest. It was the nascent stirring of a feeling I had long since packed away and stored in the attic of my heart, a feeling I had convinced myself I was better off living without. It was hope. Our friendship grew in the quiet, fertile ground of that initial connection. It was a structure built of late-night texts about meaningless things, of shared links to articles and songs, and of weekly dinners that became the anchor points of my social calendar. We were, on the surface, an unlikely pair. Leo was the sun, drawing people into his orbit, his life a constellation of social engagements, business trips, and gym sessions. I was the earth, quiet and steady, my life defined by the solitary rhythms of my work, the silent hours in the darkroom, the patient waiting for the right light, the intimate communion with my subjects through the silent intermediary of my lens. Yet, we found a strange and perfect equilibrium. He drew me out of my shell, gently coaxing me into the world, while I provided him with a quiet harbor, a place where he didn't have to perform, where the relentless energy that propelled him through his life could finally be allowed to settle. I learned the cartography of his moods, the subtle tells that betrayed the cheerful facade he presented to the world. I saw the exhaustion that sometimes gathered like storm clouds behind his eyes after a long week of travel, the faint tremor of anxiety in his hands when he spoke about a high-stakes project, the deep well of loneliness that he never spoke of, but that I could sense in the quiet moments between conversations, in the way he would sometimes just sit in silence in my apartment, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sun, as if gathering the strength to face the world again. It was in those moments that my feelings for him, which had started as a spark of interest, began to deepen into a steady, burning flame. It was an ache in my chest, a quiet, constant yearning that I kept carefully hidden behind the sturdy walls of our friendship. I loved him. It was a simple, terrifying, and immutable fact of my existence. But I was a student of unspoken things, and I knew that some truths were too fragile to be brought into the light. Our friendship was a delicate ecosystem, and I was terrified that the clumsy weight of my confession would be enough to shatter it completely. So I kept my silence. I became an expert in the art of loving from a safe distance, of treasuring the casual intimacy of our friendship, a hand on my shoulder, a shared laugh, the easy comfort of his presence. while my heart was screaming for more. I told myself it was enough. I told myself that having him in my life as a friend was infinitely better than not having him at all. And for a long time, I almost believed it. The shift began on a Tuesday in late October, when the city was surrendering to the gray melancholy of autumn. The change didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet hum of a text message. It was from Leo, a single, uncharacteristically stark sentence. Massive project just imploded. The client is pulling out. 2 years of work down the drain. There were no emojis, no self-deprecating jokes to soften the blow. Just the cold, hard fact of failure. I called him immediately, but it went to voicemail. I spent the rest of the day in a state of low-grade anxiety, my focus shattered, my thoughts circling back to him. I imagined him in his sterile office, the air thick with the ghosts of dead deadlines and broken promises, the confident armor he wore so well finally cracking under the strain. He was the one who always had the answers, the one who could charm his way through any crisis. To see him so adrift was unsettling. He finally called back late that night, his voice hollowed out, stripped of its usual warmth and resonance. He sounded smaller, younger. He told me the details in a flat monotone, describing the cascade of failures, a market shift, a key stakeholder backing out, a technological flaw they hadn't foreseen. He didn't sound angry or sad. He sounded empty, as if the energy that normally animated him had been completely drained away. I don't want to go back to my apartment, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's so quiet. I think I'll just hear the sound of me failing on a loop. The request was unspoken, hanging in the air between us, fragile and tentative. Come here, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I had a chance to second-guess them. You can take the couch. Don't be alone tonight. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I had overstepped, that I had crossed some invisible boundary. Then, I heard him exhale, a sound of such profound relief that it felt like a physical weight lifting from my own chest. Okay, he whispered. Yeah, okay. An hour later, he was at my door, looking like a ship that had been battered by a storm. His suit was rumpled, his tie was loosened, and the exhaustion I had only seen in glimpses before was now the defining feature of his face. He was carrying his work bag and a palpable aura of defeat. He didn't say much. He walked into my apartment, dropped his bag by the door, and sank onto my sofa as if his bones could no longer support his own weight. I made him tea, a simple, grounding ritual, and sat in the armchair opposite him. He stared into the steam rising from the mug, his shoulders slumped. For a long time, he didn't speak. He just sat there, inhabiting the silence I offered him, and I understood that this was what he needed most. Not advice, not platitudes, not forced cheerfulness. He needed a quiet space to simply fall apart, a place where he was not expected to be the charming, capable Leo who always had everything under control. He needed a witness to his vulnerability, and I was willing to be that for him. Eventually, he started to talk, the words coming slowly at first, then in a flood, a torrent of frustration, self-recrimination, and exhaustion. He talked about the long hours, the missed weekends, the immense pressure from his bosses, the crushing weight of expectation. He talked about feeling like an imposter, a performer who had finally forgotten his lines. I listened, not interrupting, just letting the words wash over me, offering the silent, unwavering attention that I had learned was my most valuable currency. I saw the boy behind the man, the one who was scared of not being good enough, the one who had tied so much of his self-worth to the fragile scaffolding of professional success. When he finally fell silent, the energy in the room had shifted. The raw, frantic edge of his despair had softened into a deep, bone-weary sadness. He looked at me, his eyes glassy, and gave me a small, broken smile. Sorry, he said. I just dumped all of that on you. I just shook my head. That's what friends are for, I said, and the words felt both profoundly true and woefully inadequate to describe the current that was flowing between us. He didn't need a friend. He needed an anchor. And in that moment, I resolved to be the strongest anchor he had ever known, even if it meant being shattered against the rocks of my own unspoken feelings. That night was the beginning of the ritual. He slept on my couch, wrapped in the spare duvet I kept in the hall closet. I lay awake in my own bed, in the next room, acutely aware of his presence. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of solitude, now felt charged with a new energy. I could hear the soft sound of his breathing, the occasional rustle of the duvet as he shifted in his sleep. It was an intimacy that was entirely platonic, born of crisis and convenience, and yet it felt more significant than any romantic encounter I had ever had. It was the intimacy of shared vulnerability, of quiet caretaking. The next morning, he left before I was awake, but there was a note on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for the harbor," it said. "I owe you one." I folded the note carefully and tucked it into the drawer where I kept my most precious things. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was not a one-time event. A door had been opened, and neither of us knew how to close it. The ritual, once established, quickly became a cornerstone of our lives, its foundations built on a series of unspoken agreements and plausible deniability. It began with excuses. His apartment was being painted. The plumbing had sprung a leak. A late-night meeting downtown made the commute back to his place impractical. I never questioned these reasons, just as he never acknowledged the growing transparency of them. We were co-conspirators in a gentle fiction, one that allowed him the comfort he so clearly craved without forcing either of us to confront the true nature of what was happening between us. He would arrive late, carrying the scent of the city and his own exhaustion, and the transition into our quiet, domestic routine would be seamless. We would talk for a while, our voices low, dissecting his day or mine, and then a quiet understanding would pass between us. I would get the duvet from the closet. He would change into the spare sweatpants and t-shirt he now kept in my bottom drawer, and the apartment would settle into its nocturnal rhythm. My couch was old and comfortable, but it was not designed for a man of his height. After a week of this new arrangement, he started complaining of a sore back, rubbing the space between his shoulder blades with a wince. I watched him, my heart a tangled knot of sympathy and a selfish, hopeful dread. I knew what the logical solution was, and the thought of it sent a jolt of pure terror through me. My bed was a queen, more than large enough for two people to share without touching. It was an island of solitude, a space that was entirely and exclusively mine. To invite him into it felt like a transgression of the highest order, a blurring of boundaries so profound it could never be undone. I resisted. I offered him extra pillows, a heating pad, ibuprofen. He accepted them gratefully, but the complaints continued, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of our evenings. The breaking point came on a Thursday. He had been in a series of brutal, back-to-back meetings all day, and when he arrived at my apartment, he looked utterly depleted, as if the very marrow had been scraped from his bones. He barely spoke, just collapsed onto the couch and closed his eyes. An hour later, I found him asleep in a cramped, awkward position, his long legs dangling off the end. A deep, protective instinct, fierce and undeniable, rose up in me. It eclipsed my fear, my anxiety, my relentless overanalysis. He needed to rest. It was that simple. I gently shook his shoulder. He blinked his eyes open, disoriented. "Leo," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "This is ridiculous. You can't keep sleeping like this." I saw the protest forming on his lips, the reflexive insistence that he was fine, but I cut him off. "Just take the bed." "I'll take the couch." He stared at me for a long moment, his gaze unreadable in the dim light of the living room. "No," he said finally, his voice thick with sleep. I can't kick you out of your own bed." He pushed himself into a sitting position, his movements slow and pained. "It's fine, Julian." Really, a strange boldness took hold of me then, a certainty that this was a moment that required a different kind of truth. "Then we'll share," I said, the words feeling enormous and reckless in the quiet room. "It's big enough. It's better than you waking up in pain every morning." I held my breath, waiting for the rejection, the awkward laugh, the sudden realization that a line had been crossed. Instead, he just looked at me, a flicker of something I couldn't decipher, gratitude, relief, in his tired eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Okay," he said, just as quietly. "Okay." That first night was an exercise in suspended animation. I lay on my side of the bed, my body rigid, my muscles coiled with a tension so profound it was almost painful. I was hyper-aware of every detail. The subtle dip in the mattress from his weight, the warmth radiating from his body across the small expanse of cotton sheet that separated us, the sound of his breathing, so close now, a slow, rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beat of my own heart. I felt like a man holding a lit match in a room filled with dynamite, terrified that a single wrong move, a single involuntary twitch, would detonate the fragile piece we had constructed. I imagined a line drawn down the center of the bed, an invisible border I was forbidden to cross. I stayed on my side of that line with a discipline born of pure fear, my back to him, my eyes wide open in the darkness. I was certain he was doing the same, that we were two solitary islands in a shared sea, both pretending the other wasn't there. But as the nights bled into weeks, the ritual evolved. The rigid formality of that first night began to soften, the invisible line between us becoming more permeable. It happened in small, incremental shifts, a gradual erosion of the boundaries I had so carefully erected. One night, I woke to find his arm thrown casually across my waist, his hand resting on my hip. I froze, my entire body locking up, my mind racing. He was asleep, his breathing deep and even. It was an unconscious gesture, a thoughtless act of a sleeping man seeking warmth or comfort. I knew this, but my heart didn't care about logic. It was a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, not daring to breathe, until the sheer exhaustion of my own anxiety pulled me back under. When I woke again in the morning, his arm was gone, and we never spoke of it. Another time, I woke up in the middle of the night, cold and shivering, having kicked off my half of the duvet. Before I could reach for it, I felt him stir beside me. He shifted, and without a word, without opening his eyes, he pulled the entire duvet over both of us, tucking it around my shoulders before settling back into sleep, his body now curled loosely behind mine, a warm, solid presence at my back. It was a gesture of such simple, instinctual care that it completely disarmed me. There was no artifice in it, no hidden meaning. It was just an act of kindness, performed in the liminal space between waking and sleeping. And yet, it felt like a confession. It felt like he was telling me, in the silent language of the night, that he felt safe with me, that I was his harbor. Our conversations in the dark became a new form of intimacy. Lying side by side, not having to look at each other, we found a different kind of honesty. He would talk about his childhood, about the immense pressure his father had placed on him to succeed, to be strong, to never show weakness. He spoke of past relationships that had fizzled out because he could never quite let them in, could never show them the exhausted, uncertain man who lived beneath the confident exterior. And I, in turn, found myself speaking of things I had never told anyone else. I told him about my own loneliness, about the way I used my camera as both a bridge to the world and a shield against it. I told him about my fear of being truly seen, of being found wanting. In the shared darkness of my bedroom, we were two cartographers, carefully and tentatively mapping the secret, hidden landscapes of each other's souls. The physical space between us and the bed began to shrink, until one night, there was no space at all. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a slow, gravitational pull, an unspoken acknowledgement of a shared need. We ended up facing each other, his forehead resting against mine, our legs tangled together, our shared breath warming the small space between our lips. And still, we did not kiss. The tension was a living thing in the room, a third presence in the bed with us. It was a beautiful, unbearable symphony of unspoken things, and I had no idea how it was going to end. The crossing was not a storm, but a quiet shift in the atmospheric pressure. It happened on a Sunday night, after a day of gentle, unassuming domesticity. We had spent the afternoon in comfortable silence, Me editing photos at my desk, him reading on the couch. The only sounds the soft click of my keyboard and the rustle of turning pages. We ordered pizza for dinner and watched an old movie, our shoulders pressed together. The entire day had been steeped in a sense of normalcy that was both deeply comforting and achingly poignant. This, I thought, is what it could be like. This quiet, easy rhythm. This shared space. The thought was a dangerous one, a fragile seed of hope planted in the well-tended garden of my pragmatism. Later, we were in bed, lying in our usual configuration, facing each other in the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside. The movie was over, the pizza box was empty, and the apartment was wrapped in its customary nighttime silence. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was not the companionable quiet of shared exhaustion. It was heavier, charged with all the words we had never said, all the gestures we had never made. I could feel the tension humming between us, a low, resonant frequency that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I watched his face, the way the shadows carved new landscapes into the familiar planes of his cheeks and jaw. His eyes were open, and he was watching me with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "Julian," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. It was the first word either of us had spoken in over an hour. "Yeah." My own voice was a dry whisper. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I knew, with the instinct of a man who has spent his entire life observing the subtle cues of human emotion, that we were standing at the edge of something. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just kept looking at me, his gaze searching, as if he were trying to read the answer to a question he hadn't yet dared to ask. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between a deep, ingrained caution and a powerful, undeniable need. He swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness. "Can I ask you something strange?" he whispered. I could only nod, my throat suddenly tight. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Every nerve ending in my body felt alive, alight with a terrifying, exhilarating energy. This was it, the moment the entire world had been holding its breath for. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if steeling himself. He didn't move closer, but the space between us seemed to collapse, to become charged with a gravity that was pulling us inexorably together. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice barely audible, raw with a vulnerability I had never heard from him before. "If I kissed you?" The question was not a demand. It was a plea. It was an offering of his own uncertainty, a confession of his own desire, laid bare for my consideration. He was giving me all the power, the choice to maintain the fragile peace of our friendship or to shatter it in pursuit of something more. In that moment, all my carefully constructed walls, all my fears of rejection, all my anxieties about ruining the best thing in my life, they all crumbled to dust. All that was left was the simple, profound truth that had been living in my heart for months. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the small distance that remained between us. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, hesitant, a question in itself. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was a quiet confirmation, a mutual sigh of relief. It tasted of salt and longing and the profound, earth-shattering peace of finally coming home. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and the kiss deepened, slowly, tenderly. It was a conversation held in a language older than words, a dialogue of shared loneliness and nascent hope. In the quiet of my bedroom, with the city breathing softly outside my window, the world I had known tilted on its axis and settled into a new and breathtaking alignment. The ritual was over. Something new was just beginning. The aftermath was not the gentle dawn I had imagined, but a sudden, disorienting fog. The morning after the kiss, an awkwardness descended upon us, a thick, palpable silence that felt more profound than any we had ever shared. It was as if the honesty of the previous night had been too bright, and now we were both fumbling in the shadows, blinded and unsure of our footing. Leo was quiet, his movements stiff and deliberate. He avoided my eyes, focusing on the mundane task of making coffee with an intensity that was wholly out of proportion. The easy intimacy we had built over months, the comfortable shorthand of our friendship, had vanished, replaced by the stilted politeness of two strangers who had accidentally shared a secret they didn't know how to carry. He left for work with a mumbled goodbye, and the apartment felt cavernous in his absence. The air, which had been charged with so much hope and possibility just hours before, now felt thin and empty. I spent the day in a state of suspended anxiety, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for some clue I had missed, some sign that I had misinterpreted the entire event. Had I imagined the vulnerability in his voice? Had I projected my own longing onto a simple, fleeting impulse? The doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at the fragile new hope that had taken root in my heart. My phone remained silent. The usual stream of texts from him, a funny observation, a link to an article, a simple, "How's your day?" had dried up completely. The silence was a declaration, and with every passing hour, it grew louder, more insistent. That evening, he didn't come over. I received a single, terse text around 7 o'clock. Gonna be a late one. Just gonna crash at my place tonight. There was no explanation, no apology, no promise for tomorrow. Just a closed door. I stared at the message, my chest tightening until it was hard to breathe. It felt like a verdict. I had gambled with our friendship, the most precious thing I had, and I had lost. The pain was a physical thing, a dull, heavy ache that settled deep in my bones. The quiet of my apartment, once a source of solace, was now a torment, amplifying the sound of my own frantic, looping thoughts. The bed, which had been a sanctuary of shared confessions and quiet intimacy, now felt like a vast, empty wasteland. The next few days were a special kind of hell. Leo became a ghost. He was polite, distant, his texts brief and functional. He was always busy, always had a prior commitment, always had a plausible reason to avoid seeing me. He built a fortress of excuses around himself, and I was left on the outside, looking at the impenetrable walls, wondering what had gone so terribly wrong. I cycled through a vortex of emotions, confusion, hurt, a deep, simmering anger, and beneath it all, a profound, gut-wrenching sadness. He had initiated it. He had asked the question. He had opened the door, and then, as soon as I had stepped through it, he had slammed it shut in my face. The cruelty of it, whether intentional or not, was staggering. After a week of this agonizing silence, I realized I couldn't go on like this. The ambiguity was killing me, hollowing me out from the inside. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I dreaded most. I needed to hear him say it, to confirm that it was a mistake, that he regretted it, that we could go back to being friends, though I knew, with a sickening certainty, that there was no going back. The innocence of our previous dynamic had been irrevocably lost, but even a painful truth was better than this suffocating uncertainty. I steeled myself, my hands trembling as I typed out a simple message. "We need to talk. Can I come over?" The three dots that indicated he was typing appeared and disappeared several times before a reply finally came through. Okay. Walking to his apartment felt like walking to my own execution. Every step was heavy, laden with the weight of my own dashed hopes. His building was a sleek, impersonal tower of glass and steel, a world away from the lived-in comfort of my own small place. When he opened the door, he looked as exhausted and miserable as I felt. The confident, easygoing man I had first met at my sister's party was gone, replaced by a stranger with haunted eyes and a tense, defensive posture. His apartment was immaculate, sterile, a perfect reflection of the emotional distance he was now trying to enforce. There was none of the comfortable clutter of my place, none of the warmth. It was a space designed for a life that was neat, orderly, and devoid of messy, complicated feelings. He didn't invite me to sit. We stood in his entryway, the air thick with unspoken things. I was the one who finally broke the silence. "What happened, Leo?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady. "What changed?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a point over my shoulder, his jaw tight. "Nothing," he said, the word clipped and unconvincing. "I've just been busy." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, that it sparked a flicker of anger in me. "Don't," I said, my voice gaining an edge. "Don't do that. Don't treat me like I'm an idiot. One night, you kiss me, and the next, you act like I don't exist. I deserve more than that. I deserve an explanation." He finally looked at me then, and I saw the raw panic in his eyes. He looked like a cornered animal. "I don't know what you want me to say, Julian," he said, his voice strained. It was a mistake. I was stressed. I was tired. I wasn't thinking clearly. It shouldn't have happened. Each word was a physical blow. A mistake. The most honest, beautiful moment of my life, reduced to a symptom of stress. The hurt was so sharp, so intense, it almost buckled my knees. But my anger held me upright. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice shaking now, not with sadness, but with a cold, clear rage. "You asked me. You looked me in the eye and you asked me if you could kiss me. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice. So what I want is for you to stop hiding behind these pathetic excuses and tell me the truth. Why are you so terrified?" My question hung in the air, a direct challenge he couldn't deflect. He flinched, his carefully constructed composure finally shattering. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements agitated, and for the first time, he looked truly lost. "Because I don't know what this is," he burst out, his voice cracking with a desperation that mirrored my own. "Because it doesn't make any sense. You and me. I've never. It's not how my life is supposed to go. I had a plan, a blueprint. This isn't in the blueprint." He was pacing now, his long strides eating up the small space of the entryway. "Being with you, in your apartment, it's the only place I've felt calm. The only place I don't have to be on, and it felt so good, so right, and that scared the hell out of me. Because I started to need it. I started to need you. And that kiss, it just made it real. And I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to be that person." His confession, a torrent of fear and confusion, washed over me, extinguishing my anger and leaving a profound, aching sorrow in its place. He wasn't pushing me away because he didn't feel anything. He was pushing me away because he felt everything. He was terrified of his own feelings, of the way they defied the neat, orderly life he had tried to build for himself. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a part of himself he didn't understand and didn't know how to accept. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and I saw past the fear, past the confusion, to the lonely, scared man at the center of it all. The same man who had shown up at my door weeks ago, broken and in need of a harbor. He still needed one. He just didn't believe he deserved it. The confrontation in his sterile hallway had stripped us both bare. His panicked confession, his fear of a feeling that didn't fit into the blueprint of his life, had left him exposed and vulnerable. My anger had dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant empathy. I saw him not as the man who had hurt me, but as a man who was hurting himself, trapped in a cage of his own expectations. The silence that followed his outburst was different from the one that had tormented me for days. This was a silence of exhaustion, of truths finally spoken aloud, however messy and incomplete. I took a slow breath, letting the quiet settle, letting the raw emotion in the room begin to cool. "So you're just going to throw it away?" I asked, my voice soft now, devoid of accusation. "Everything we have, our friendship, the quiet, the calm, you're going to sacrifice all of that because you're scared? Because it's not in your blueprint?" I took a step closer to him, closing the distance he had tried so hard to create between us. He stopped pacing and stood still, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Leo," I said, meeting his gaze and holding it. "Life isn't a blueprint. It's a photograph we're developing in the dark. We don't know what the final image will look like. We just have to trust the process. We have to trust the light." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a storm of conflicting emotions. "I don't know how," he whispered, the admission a raw and honest surrender. "I've spent my whole life being what everyone else expected me to be. The good son, the star athlete, the successful consultant. I don't know who I am without that. Maybe," I said gently, "you're the person who feels calm in my apartment. Maybe you're the person who tells me stories in the dark. Maybe you're the person who kissed me on a Sunday night because it felt more real than anything else." I reached out, my hand hesitating for a moment before I rested it on his arm. His skin was warm. He didn't pull away. You don't have to have it all figured out, I continued. You just have to be willing to find out. With me, tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. He looked down at my hand on his arm, then back up at my face. A long, shuddering breath escaped him, as if he were letting go of something he had been holding on to for a very long time. I'm sorry, Julian, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was just so lost, I know, I said. And I did. I knew because I had been lost, too, in my own quiet way, before he had walked into my life. We were two lost souls who had found a temporary map in each other. That night, he came back to my apartment. He didn't bring an overnight bag. He didn't need one anymore. His things were already there, woven into the fabric of my home. There were no excuses, no pretexts. Just a shared, unspoken understanding. When we got into bed, the awkwardness was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile tenderness. He turned to me, his expression open and searching. Can we just lie here for a minute? He asked. I nodded, and he moved closer, resting his head on my chest, his arm wrapping around my waist. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my ribs. I rested my chin on the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of him, and wrapped my arms around his shoulders, holding him close. We didn't talk. We didn't kiss. We just held each other, two people finding their way back from the brink. In the quiet of the room, in the simple, profound act of holding and being held, we began to heal. The days that followed were a period of quiet realignment. We were learning a new language, one that included not just unspoken understanding, but also tentative, spoken truths. We talked. We had the conversations we should have had long ago, exploring the new territory we found ourselves in with the caution and a reverence it deserved. He spoke of his fear, and I spoke of my longing. We laid all our cards on the table, the hopes and the anxieties, the insecurities and the deep, abiding affection. It was not always easy. There were moments of awkwardness, of missteps, of reverting to old, defensive patterns. But we were patient with each other. We were learning to trust this new, fragile thing we were building, to believe that it was strong enough to withstand the occasional tremor of uncertainty. The ritual of him staying over was reborn, but it was different now. It was no longer a solution to a crisis or a matter of convenience. It was a choice. It was an act of intentional togetherness. The couch was forgotten. The bed was no longer a space of unspoken tension and invisible borders, but a shared sanctuary. The physical intimacy between us grew naturally, an organic extension of the emotional honesty we were cultivating. It was in the way he would reach for my hand while we were watching a movie, his fingers lacing through mine. It was in the casual way I would lean my head on his shoulder while I was reading. It was in the long, slow, sleepy kisses we shared in the morning light, kisses that tasted of coffee and the promise of a new day. He started leaving more of himself at my apartment, not just a toothbrush and a change of clothes, but pieces of his life. A book he was reading appeared on my nightstand. His running shoes found a permanent home by my front door. One day, I came home to find he had bought a new, ridiculously soft bath mat for the bathroom because, he said, the old one was an insult to bare feet. My apartment, my solitary fortress, was slowly, beautifully, becoming our home. I, in turn, began to venture out more into his world. I met his work colleagues, people who had only ever seen the polished, professional Leo. They looked at me with a friendly curiosity, and I saw in their eyes a reflection of the change in him. He was calmer, they said. He smiled more. He seemed happy. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. I found Leo standing at the stove, attempting to make pancakes from scratch, a dusting of flour on his cheek. He was humming softly to himself, a picture of such simple, unself-conscious contentment that it made my heart ache with a feeling so full it was almost painful. He looked up and saw me watching him, and his face broke into that slow, easy smile that I had first seen across a crowded party. But this smile was different. It wasn't for a crowd. It wasn't a performance. It was just for me. He walked over, wiping his floury hands on his jeans, and kissed me softly. "Morning," he said. "I'm making a mess." I looked around my kitchen, at the dusting of flour on every surface, at the lumpy batter in the bowl, at the man standing in front of me, his eyes full of a quiet, steady love. "It's the most beautiful mess I've ever seen," I said. And I meant it. We found our rhythm, a gentle, steady cadence that felt as natural as breathing. Our lives, once so separate, began to merge, not in a way that erased our individual selves, but in a way that created a stronger, more resonant whole. We were still the sun and the earth, but we had found our perfect orbit, a balance of light and shadow, of outward energy and inward peace. The quiet observer and the unknowing initiator had finally learned to speak the same language. The door to my apartment, which had once been a symbol of a boundary he needed to cross to find sanctuary, was now simply the door to our home. He had the key. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and then there are the moments that follow, the ones where the disguise falls away and you are left with the beautiful, unvarnished truth. The truth was this: love is not always a lightning strike or a grand, dramatic revelation. Sometimes it is a slow, quiet process of development, an image emerging gradually in the gentle chemistry of trust and time. It is the steady accumulation of small kindnesses, of shared silences, of brave, fumbling confessions. It is the profound peace of knowing that you have a harbor in the storm, a safe place to be your most vulnerable, unvarnished self. We never did figure out a label for what we were in those early days. We didn't need one. We were just Julian and Leo. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, that was more than enough. It was everything.